The air in the courtroom was thick with the stench of a lie, suffocating the innocent and perfuming the corrupt. On one side, a family wept. Their son, David Carter, a good man now branded a felon. On the other, three of the city's most decorated detectives, Jack Donovan, Kevin Russo, and Michael Chen, exchanged triumphant smirks. They had won. The frame job was perfect, the evidence they planted was irrefutable, and their careers were about to skyrocket. They were untouchable gods in blue uniforms, but in the back row, a black woman in a simple dark gray suit watched them, her face an unreadable mask of calm. They had dismissed her, forgotten her, and in that moment of their greatest victory, they had no idea they were celebrating on the edge of their own abyss. The final fatal sound was the sharp crack of the gavel. It echoed in the cavernous silence of courtroom 4B, a sound that hammered the last nail into the coffin of David Carter's freedom. Guilty on all counts. The words delivered by the weary, jowly Judge Carmichael felt less like a verdict and more like an incantation, sealing a dark spell. A gut-wrenching sob tore from the throat of Maria Carter, David's mother. It was a sound of pure, undiluted agony that seemed to physically ripple through the spectators' gallery. Her husband, a stoic man named Robert, wrapped a trembling arm around her, his own face a portrait of shattered strength. Their son David stood numbly between his defense attorneys, his shoulders slumped not in guilt, but under the crushing weight of a monstrous injustice. He was a community organizer, a man who had fought to get a youth center built, a man who had dared to speak out against the rising tide of crime and the aggressive, unaccountable tactics of the city's Special Investigations Unit. Now he was a convicted drug kingpin, sentenced to a future behind bars for a crime he didn't commit. Across the aisle, the architects of his demise reveled in their masterpiece. Detective Jack Donovan, the charismatic leader of the trio, ran a hand through his perfectly coiffed salt and pepper hair. A slow, satisfied smile played on his lips. He was the golden boy of the department, his face plastered on recruitment posters. He leaned back, the leather of the bench groaning under his weight, and shared a look with his partners. Officer Kevin Russo, a bull of a man with a neck as thick as a fire hydrant and knuckles scarred from more than just police work, gave a nearly imperceptible nod. His was the brute force, the intimidation, the boot that kicked down doors first and worried about warrants later. He was Donovan's loyal hammer. And then there was Sergeant Michael Chen. Quieter, more cerebral, Chen was the brains behind the paperwork. He was the master of the plausible narrative, the artist who could paint a picture of guilt with nothing but doctored evidence logs and perjured affidavits. He adjusted his glasses, a flicker of something, pride, relief, perhaps even a sliver of cold amusement in his eyes. The prosecutor, a young ambitious man named Bill Peterson, who owed his recent string of high-profile convictions to Donovan's unit, came over to shake their hands. "Incredible work, Jack," Peterson gushed, his voice a little too loud. "You and your team delivered. The city is safer because of you." "Just doing our job, Bill," Donovan said, his voice smooth as aged whiskey. He clapped Peterson on the shoulder. "Making sure the trash gets taken out." His eyes flickered over to David Carter, a look of utter contempt on his face. This was more than a conviction. It was a message. Stay out of their business. Don't ask questions. Don't challenge their authority. The courtroom began to clear. Reporters scrambled for the exit, eager to file their stories about the fall of the community wolf in sheep's clothing. The jury, having fulfilled their duty, filed out with downcast eyes, avoiding the gaze of the Carter family. The system, in all its majestic, flawed power, had churned out its result. Donovan, Russo, and Chen remained seated for a moment, savoring the victory. "Steak and scotch tonight, boys?" Donovan murmured, his voice low and conspiratorial. "On me. A celebration of a job well done." "Hell yeah," Russo grunted. "I've been tasting that ribeye all day." Chen simply nodded, pushing his glasses up his nose. "The paperwork on the asset forfeiture will be a nightmare. The properties, the vehicles, a nightmare worth having," Donovan chuckled. "That community center Carter was always crying about? I hear the city's looking to sell the land cheap now. Maybe a few investors could pick it up." He winked. The unspoken meaning was clear. The spoils of their war were ready to be divided. As they finally rose to leave, their chests puffed out, Donovan's gaze swept the near-empty courtroom. He saw the weeping mother, the broken father, the cuffed son being led away. He felt nothing. Then his eyes landed on her. The woman in the back row. She hadn't moved. She just sat there in a simple, impeccably tailored dark gray suit, a leather portfolio resting on her lap. She was black, perhaps in her late 40s, with hair pulled back in a severe, elegant bun. Her face was serene, but her eyes were a different story. They were dark, intelligent, and held an intensity that seemed to cut through the celebratory haze. She wasn't weeping. She wasn't angry. She was observing. Donovan had noticed her during the trial. He'd dismissed her as a cousin from out of town, maybe a church friend of the family. A nobody. Now, something about her stillness unnerved him. He nudged Russo. "Who's the ice queen in the back?" he muttered. Russo squinted. "Dunno. One of Carter's bleeding heart supporters, probably. Forget her. Let's go." Donovan shrugged it off. Russo was right. She was nothing. A ghost at their feast. He turned his back on her, a final act of dismissal, and led his triumphant crew towards the courtroom doors, walking into the bright lights of the courthouse hallway and the adoring cameras of the press. They were heroes. They were untouchable. And the woman in the gray suit was already a forgotten detail in the story of their greatest success. Just as Donovan's hand touched the ornate brass handle of the courtroom door, a voice calm and clear as a bell sliced through the air. "Detective Donovan." It wasn't loud, but it had an authority that commanded attention. Every person remaining in the room, the bailiffs, the court clerk, the defense team, and the 3 victorious cops, froze. The voice belonged to the woman in the gray suit. Donovan turned slowly, an annoyed smirk already forming on his face. He expected a tearful plea, a hysterical accusation from one of Carter's groupies. He was ready to wave a dismissive hand and let a bailiff handle it. "Can I help you, ma'am?" he asked, his tone dripping with condescension. "The show's over. Visiting hours at the state penitentiary will be posted online." The woman stood up. She moved with a liquid grace that was both deliberate and powerful. She wasn't tall, but she possessed a presence that seemed to fill the space she occupied. She held her portfolio under one arm and walked not towards them, but towards the now empty judge's bench. "Actually, Detective," she said, her voice echoing slightly in the chamber, "the show is just beginning." Judge Carmichael, who had been gathering his papers, looked up, irritated. "Ma'am, this is a restricted area. The proceedings are concluded." The woman placed her portfolio on the prosecution's table. She looked at the judge, then at Donovan, her gaze sweeping over Russo and Chen with unnerving precision. A new energy was crackling in the room, an electric tension that made the hairs on Russo's thick arms stand on end. The cops' triumphant smiles had vanished, replaced by masks of wary confusion. "With all due respect, Your Honor," the woman said, her tone polite but steel-edged, "these proceedings are far from concluded. They are, in fact, now a federal matter." A nervous laugh escaped Donovan's lips. "A federal matter? Ma'am, I think you've been watching too much television. This was a state and local case. You have no standing here." "My standing," the woman said, her voice dropping a register, becoming colder, harder, "is not in question." She turned to face the 3 detectives fully. The mask of serenity was gone, replaced by an expression of such focused, diamond-hard intensity that it felt like a physical force. For the first time, a genuine sliver of doubt, cold and sharp, pierced Donovan's armor of arrogance. "Detective Jack Donovan, Officer Kevin Russo, Sergeant Michael Chen," she said, reciting their names like an indictment. "For the past 6 months, my office has been conducting a parallel investigation into the systemic corruption within the City Police Department's Special Investigations Unit, an investigation focusing specifically on racketeering, evidence tampering, conspiracy to deprive a citizen of his civil rights, and money laundering." The air was sucked out of the room. Chen's face went pale, a sickly, chalky white. Russo's jaw went slack, his bravado evaporating like mist. Donovan's heart began to pound a frantic, heavy rhythm against his ribs. "Your office?" Judge Carmichael demanded, his voice shaky. Who in God's name are you? The woman reached into the inner pocket of her suit jacket. She produced a small leather billfold and flipped it open. She didn't flash it. She held it up, steady and sure, for the judge to see. Then she turned it towards the three detectives. The gold seal of the Department of Justice gleamed under the courtroom lights. But it was the title, printed in stark black letters beneath a stern-faced photograph, that made the world stop. "My name," she said, her voice now resonating with the full weight of the United States government, "is Dr. Evelyn Reed. I am the director of the Federal Bureau of Investigation." Silence. It was a profound, absolute silence, deeper than any Donovan had ever known. It was the sound of a world ending. The smirks, the confidence, the planned steak dinners, it all shattered into a million pieces of glittering dust. The blood drained from Donovan's face, leaving him looking gray and old. Russo looked like he might be sick. Chen swayed on his feet, reaching out to steady himself on the back of the bench in front of him. The Ice Queen, the nobody, the bleeding heart supporter. She was the director of the FBI. She had been sitting there day after day, not as a spectator, but as a predator. Watching them, studying them, waiting. They hadn't been celebrating a victory. They had been performing their guilt on the grandest possible stage, right in front of the one person in the country who could bring their entire corrupt empire crashing down around them. "Bailiff," Director Reed said, her voice snapping with command, "secure the doors. No one leaves. And Your Honor, I believe you will want to see what's in this portfolio. It contains the motion to vacate the verdict against Mr. David Carter and the federal arrest warrants for these three men." The celebration was over. The karma had just walked through the door. 6 months earlier, the tip had come in the old-fashioned way, not through a secure digital channel or a clandestine meeting, but in a plain manila envelope slipped under the door of the FBI's resident agency office in the city's federal building. There was no note, no signature, just a single unlabeled USB drive. In Washington, D.C., in the sprawling, state-of-the-art Strategic Information and Operations Center at the J. Edgar Hoover Building, Director Evelyn Reed had watched the file upload on a secure terminal. She had been director for just under 2 years, appointed after a career spent climbing the ladder from field agent in the Violent Crimes Division to section chief at Quantico to assistant director of the Criminal Investigative Division. She was known for her photographic memory, her background in forensic psychology, and an almost preternatural ability to see patterns where others saw chaos. The file contained a single audio recording. The quality was poor, muffled, clearly recorded on a hidden device. But the voices were distinct. One was smooth and confident, Detective Jack Donovan's. The other was a low grunt, Officer Kevin Russo's. "The Carter kid is getting too loud," Donovan's voice said. "The council is starting to ask questions about our seizure budgets. He's putting a target on our whole operation." "So we lean on him," Russo's voice rumbled. "A little late-night visit, a busted taillight that turns into a resisting charge." "Too small," Donovan's voice replied dismissively. "We need to remove him, permanently. Not a body bag, that's messy. A cage. We need to discredit him so completely that no one ever listens to him again. We need to make him a monster." "The stash from the dock raid last month," Russo suggested. "The high-grade stuff we logged as destroyed?" "Exactly. Chen is already working the angles on the warrant, a confidential informant who doesn't exist. We'll toss his apartment, plant the brick in his classic car, the one he's so proud of, make it look like he's the supplier for the whole West Side. By the time he gets out of prison, he'll be a grandfather." Evelyn Reed listened to the recording 3 times. Her face remained impassive, but a cold fire ignited in her gut. This wasn't just corruption. It was a perversion of everything she had dedicated her life to. It was cynical, arrogant, and evil. This wasn't about a bad apple. This was about a poisoned orchard. She didn't storm into the local police commissioner's office. She didn't call a press conference. That was not her way. A public accusation would send the rats scurrying into the walls, destroying evidence, circling the wagons. No, this kind of disease required surgery, not a bandage. It had to be cut out at the root, quietly and with overwhelming force. Her first call was to a man named Arthur Sterling, the head of the FBI's Public Corruption Unit. Sterling was old school, a bulldog of an agent who trusted paper trails more than people. "Arthur," she said, her voice low, "I'm sending you a file. I want a ghost team. Off book, top clearance only. I want financial forensics run on Donovan, Russo, and a Sergeant Michael Chen. Every dollar, every shell corporation, every offshore account. I want to know where they buy their coffee and who pays for it." Her second directive was to the Technical Services Division. "I want full spectrum surveillance on the SIU, mobile, physical, and electronic. I want to know who they talk to, what they type, where they go. I want a digital ghost attached to each one of them. And I want it all sealed at the highest level. No local law enforcement collaboration. No one outside the team knows this is happening. As far as the world is concerned, the SIU is clean as a whistle." For the next 6 months, Director Reed orchestrated a silent, invisible war. While Donovan and his crew were building their case against David Carter, the FBI was building a much larger one against them. The FBI team, operating out of a rented, nondescript warehouse on the industrial outskirts of the city, worked in shifts. Financial analysts, led by a prodigy from MIT named Chloe Evans, unraveled a complex web of shell corporations and real estate holdings. They found that Donovan, on a detective's salary, owned 3 luxury condos, all registered to an LLC whose address traced back to a P.O. box in the Cayman Islands. Russo had made a series of large cash deposits into a gambling account in Vegas, far exceeding his declared income. And Chen, the quiet one, had been funneling money to his family in Taiwan through a complex network of import-export businesses. The money all originated from their asset forfeiture seizures, cash, cars, and property they skimmed before it was ever officially logged. Meanwhile, a technical team used signal intelligence to intercept their communications. They decrypted encrypted messaging apps, capturing conversations where the 3 cops laughed about the evidence they were fabricating against Carter. They spoke of their informant, Jimmy Eyes, a fictional character Chen had created, with a backstory so detailed he even had a fake social media profile. The physical surveillance team tailed them, capturing photos of Donovan meeting with a known mob enforcer, Anthony the Suit Gallo, and Russo accepting cash-filled envelopes behind a strip club. They watched as the pieces of the frame-up against David Carter were meticulously put into place. The most crucial piece of the puzzle, however, was the mole. Director Reed knew the original USB drive had to have come from inside the department. Using voice print analysis and cross-referencing personnel files, they identified the likely source, a young rookie officer named Ben Peterson, who had recently been assigned to, and then quickly transferred out of, the SIU. An agent made discreet contact. Peterson was terrified, racked with guilt. He confessed that he had been in the room during the conversation on the recording, assigned to watch the door. The blatant criminality had horrified him. He knew reporting it through normal channels would be a career-ending and possibly life-ending move. Slipping the drive to the FBI was a desperate act of conscience. Director Reed spoke to Peterson herself via a secure video link. She didn't threaten or cajole. She listened. She saw not a coward, but a young man with a moral compass, trapped in an impossible situation. "Officer Peterson," she said calmly, "you have a choice. You can be a footnote in their corruption, or you can be a key author in the story of their downfall. We will protect you. You have my word on that." Peterson, his voice choked with emotion, agreed to testify. As the trial against David Carter began, Director Reed made a decision that surprised her entire team. She would attend, in person. "They need to be comfortable," she explained to Sterling. "They need to feel invincible. Their arrogance is their greatest vulnerability. I want to watch them walk into their own trap. I want to see their faces when they realize the cage was never for David Carter. It was for them." So she sat day after day in the back of the courtroom. She listened to the perjured testimony. She watched the fabricated evidence be presented as fact. She saw the smug, self-satisfied looks on their faces. And with every lie they told, every right they violated, they tightened the noose the FBI had so patiently, so silently, placed around their own necks. Back in the electric tension of courtroom 4B, Director Reed didn't wait for the shock to subside. She was a conductor, and the evidence was her orchestra. It was time for the crescendo. "Your Honor," she said, turning her attention back to the stunned Judge Carmichael, Before I present the federal warrants, I move to introduce new evidence pertaining to the case of the state versus David Carter. Evidence that proves, beyond any doubt, his absolute innocence and exposes the criminal conspiracy that put him in that defendant's chair. Donovan, snapping out of his stupor, found his voice. It was hoarse, desperate. Objection! This is a circus. You can't just hijack a trial after the verdict. This is procedural madness. Director Reed gave him a look so cold it could have frozen fire. Detective, you are the subject of a federal investigation into racketeering and conspiracy. I would advise you to remain silent. Anything you say can and will be used against you. She then turned back to the judge. Your Honor, the integrity of this court has been compromised. Procedure is a shield for the innocent, not a fortress for the guilty. I implore you to see this through. Judge Carmichael, his face pale but his judicial instincts kicking in, looked from Reed's unyielding face to the terrified expressions of the three officers he had just lauded as heroes. He nodded slowly. The court will hear this new evidence. Proceed, Director Reed. Reed nodded to one of the two stern-faced men in dark suits who had entered behind her and were now guarding the doors. He wheeled in a large monitor and placed it facing the judge and the jury box, though the jury was long gone. He connected a laptop. Let's begin with the foundation of the state's case, Reed announced, her voice filling the room. The confidential informant, known as Jimmy Eyes, whose sworn testimony was the basis for the search warrant on Mr. Carter's property. She clicked a key. An image appeared on the screen. A goofy-looking stock photo of a man in a fishing hat, pulled from a generic image website. This is the man Sergeant Chen provided in his affidavit as the likeness of his informant. However, our investigation found something different. She clicked again. The screen was now filled with lines of code, social media profiles, and forum posts. This is the digital footprint of Jimmy Eyes. It was created by Sergeant Chen 3 months ago on a burner phone. The profile picture was posted once. The account was used to like 3 local pizza parlors to give it a veneer of authenticity, and it has had no other activity. Jimmy Eyes is a work of fiction. Chen flinched as if he'd been struck. He stared at the screen, at his own digital breadcrumbs laid bare for all to see. Next, Reed continued, her pacing deliberate, the evidence itself. The state claimed to have found a kilogram of pure, uncut cocaine in Mr. Carter's vehicle. Their own forensic report, which we have here, she held up a document, states the cocaine was of South American origin, likely from the Gomez cartel supply chain. This was used to paint Mr. Carter as a major player. She paused, letting the silence hang heavy. However, the FBI forensics lab ran a spectrographic analysis on a sample of the cocaine that was logged as destroyed from the SIU's dock raid 6 months ago. A sample a certain young officer had the foresight to preserve before it was destroyed. Let's see the comparison. 2 complex chemical graphs appeared on the screen, side by side. They were identical. The drugs found in Mr. Carter's car were not from a South American cartel. They were from the dock raid, the very same batch Detective Donovan and Officer Russo are heard discussing planting in this next exhibit. The courtroom fell into an even deeper hush. The bailiff stood rigid. David Carter was on his feet now, his face a mixture of shock and dawning, unbelievable hope. His mother was clutching his father's arm, her weeping silenced by sheer astonishment. Reed pressed another key. The muffled, scratchy audio from the USB drive filled the courtroom. Plant the brick in his classic car, the one he's so proud of. Make it look like he's the supplier for the whole West Side. Donovan's own voice, confident and cruel, damned him from the speakers. Russo shut his eyes, his face glistening with sweat. That recording, Reed stated, was the beginning of our hunt, but it is far from the end. For the past 6 months, we have been monitoring you. She looked directly at Donovan, then Russo, then Chen. We know about the shell company, Donovan Holdings LLC, registered in the Caymans. We have the statements from the 7 straw buyers you used to launder the money from seized assets to purchase your 3 condos. An intricate financial chart appeared on the screen, a spiderweb of transactions leading directly from city auction accounts to Donovan's offshore haven. Officer Russo, she said, turning her gaze on the burly cop, who now seemed to shrink in his uniform. We have video surveillance of you accepting cash payments from known underworld figures, and we have your casino markers from Las Vegas, showing you laundering that cash at the blackjack tables. Photos flashed on the screen. Russo in a dimly lit alley, his hand outstretched. Casino receipts, bank statements. And Sergeant Chen, she said, her voice softening, almost imperceptibly, as if addressing a man already broken. We traced the wire transfers, over $200,000, skimmed from evidence lockers, funneled through your cousin's import business, and sent to your family overseas. You bought them a house with the proceeds of your corruption. Chen finally broke. He sank into his chair, burying his face in his hands, his body shaking with silent sobs. Donovan, however, was made of different stuff. Rage, pure and undiluted, burned away his fear. This is an illegal search. You had no right. This is entrapment. It's all inadmissible, he roared, his voice cracking. Everything we have was obtained with a federal warrant signed by a FISA court judge, based on the evidence of a conspiracy against the United States in the form of depriving a citizen of his rights under color of law, Reed retorted, her voice like ice. It is all, I assure you, meticulously admissible, but I understand you may have doubts, which is why I have one final piece of evidence to present today. She looked towards the main courtroom doors. You may bring him in. The doors opened. Flanked by two more FBI agents, a young uniformed police officer walked into the courtroom. He was pale and visibly trembling, but his eyes were fixed and determined. It was Officer Ben Peterson. Russo's head snapped up. Peterson? You son of a bitch, he snarled, taking a step forward before a bailiff put a firm hand on his chest. Officer Peterson has given a full, sworn confession, Reed announced. He was there when you planned this. He will testify to every detail of the frame-up. He will testify about the skimming operations. He will testify about the culture of corruption you fostered in the SIU. He will be the first witness for the prosecution in the federal case against you. This was the final, devastating blow. The audio, the financials, the forensics, it was all damning. But seeing one of their own, in uniform, ready to testify against them, was the ultimate betrayal. It was the moment the illusion of the blue wall of silence crumbled into dust. Donovan stared at Peterson, his face a mask of utter hatred. The game was over. He wasn't a hero or a kingpin. He was just a criminal, caught red-handed, his symphony of lies silenced by a symphony of truth. The sound that followed was not a gavel, but the sharp, metallic click of handcuffs. It was a sound that echoed the finality of the judge's verdict, but this time, it was aimed at the right people. Director Reed nodded to her agents. Detective Donovan, Officer Russo, Sergeant Chen, she said, her voice devoid of any triumph, filled only with the grim finality of duty. You are under arrest for violations of the Racketeer Influenced and Corrupt Organizations Act, conspiracy to deprive rights under color of law, evidence tampering, and money laundering. Two agents moved towards Donovan. For a second, he stood frozen, his mind refusing to process the reality. Then his survival instincts, honed by years of bullying and intimidation, took over. You can't do this, he snarled, his voice a raw rasp. He took a step back, puffing out his chest in a last pathetic display of authority. I am a decorated officer of the law. You were an officer of the law, one of the agents, a tall man with a jaw of granite, said calmly. Right now, you're a federal suspect, hands behind your back. Now. When Donovan hesitated, the agent moved with swift, practiced efficiency. He grabbed Donovan's arm, twisted it behind his back, and slammed the first cuff onto his wrist. The sound of the ratcheting steel was brutally loud in the silent room. Donovan's face contorted in a mask of rage and humiliation. The swaggering hero of the 5 o'clock news was gone, replaced by a common, cornered criminal. You'll hear from my lawyer, he spat, his face turning purple. This is a witch hunt. Reed, you'll pay for this. Director Reed simply watched him, her expression unchanging. His threats were the impotent howls of a king who had just been dethroned. Russo offered no such resistance. The fight had drained out of him completely. When the agents approached, he seemed to deflate, his massive shoulders slumping. He put his hands behind his back meekly, his gaze fixed on the floor. The brute, the enforcer, was reduced to a compliant, terrified man. The only sound he made was a low, guttural moan, the sound of his world caving in. The agents cuffing Sergeant Chen were gentle. He was still seated, his face in his hands. One of them tapped him softly on the shoulder. "Sergeant, you need to stand up." Chen lifted his head. His glasses were askew and tears streamed down his cheeks. He looked not at the agents, but at Director Reed. There was no hatred in his eyes, only a strange, desolate sense of understanding. It was the look of a man who had been running a marathon of lies and was simply too exhausted to take another step. He stood on shaky legs and allowed himself to be cuffed without a word. The courtroom doors opened again, and a flood of reporters, who had been held back by federal agents in the hallway, surged forward. Their cameras flashed, creating a strobe-like effect that illuminated the scene in stark, brutal detail. The triumphant press conference they had been expecting had turned into a perp walk. The headlines were writing themselves. Through this chaos, a different drama was unfolding. Judge Carmichael, looking down from his bench, cleared his throat. His voice, now firm and resolute, boomed across the room. "In light of the evidence presented, this court finds that a grave miscarriage of justice has occurred. The verdict against Mr. David Carter is hereby vacated. All charges are dismissed with prejudice. Mr. Carter, you are a free man. This court offers its most profound apologies." The words hung in the air for a moment, and then Maria Carter let out a cry. Not of pain this time, but of pure, unadulterated joy. She flung her arms around her son, who was still trying to process his liberation. Robert Carter, the stoic father, finally broke, tears of relief streaming down his face as he joined the embrace. David Carter looked over his mother's shoulder, his eyes finding Director Reed's amidst the swirling chaos. He couldn't speak. He simply nodded, his expression one of overwhelming gratitude. Reed gave him a small, almost imperceptible nod in return. This was why she did it. Not for the arrests, not for the headlines, but for this. For the moment when the scales, so violently tipped, were finally set right. As the three disgraced officers were led out of the courtroom, their paths crossed. Donovan, his face contorted with hate, glared at the celebrating Carter family. Russo couldn't look at them, his shame too profound. Chen just stared ahead, his eyes empty. They were being led through the same doors they had planned to exit as heroes, now in chains, their careers and lives in ruins. The gilded cage they had built for another had snapped shut on them. The karma was not just hard, it was poetic. They were stripped of their authority in the very room where they had abused it. They were exposed by the same legal system they had twisted for their own gain. They had wanted to make David Carter a monster, but in the end, they had only revealed the monstrosities within themselves. Outside, the city was already buzzing. News alerts pinged on every phone. The story was exploding. The untouchable cops were not just touched, they were crushed. And standing calmly in the eye of the hurricane she had created, Director Evelyn Reed knew this was only the end of the beginning. The reaping had been swift, but planting the seeds for true, lasting justice would be the harder work to come. 16 months later, the echoes of that day in courtroom 4B still resonated through the city. The trials of Donovan, Russo, and Chen were not swift. Donovan, true to his nature, fought every step of the way. He hired a high-priced, notoriously aggressive defense attorney, a man named Lawrence Pike, who specialized in defending dirty cops. Pike threw everything at the wall: motions to suppress evidence, accusations of FBI overreach, claims of a political vendetta by Director Reed. He tried to paint Donovan as a flawed patriot, a man who bent the rules to take down criminals, a necessary evil in a dangerous world. The jury didn't buy it. Against the mountain of evidence, the financial records, the surveillance footage, Officer Peterson's unwavering and emotional testimony, Donovan's defense crumbled. The audio recording of him planning to frame an innocent man was the final nail. When it was played for the jury, a visible ripple of disgust went through the box. Jack Donovan was found guilty on all counts and sentenced to 25 years in a federal penitentiary with no possibility of parole. The judge, a stern woman named Eleanor Vance, made a point of noting his utter lack of remorse and profound arrogance in her sentencing remarks. The former golden boy, now balding and paunchy from prison food, was led away in shackles, shouting obscenities at the prosecutor. Kevin Russo and Michael Chen chose a different path. Faced with the undeniable evidence, they accepted plea bargains in exchange for their full cooperation with the wider investigation. Russo, stripped of his bravado, gave a tearful confession, detailing years of extortion and brutality under Donovan's command. He was sentenced to 12 years. Chen's cooperation was even more devastating to the corrupt elements of the force. With his meticulous, detail-oriented mind, he laid out the entire architecture of the SIU's criminal enterprise. He explained how they manipulated evidence logs, created ghost informants, and laundered money through the asset forfeiture system. His testimony implicated another 7 officers, including a deputy chief, in the conspiracy. He received a sentence of 8 years, his cooperation sparing him a longer term. The fallout in the city police department was cataclysmic. The Special Investigations Unit was disbanded entirely. The deputy chief implicated by Chen resigned in disgrace hours before his arrest. The police commissioner was forced out by the mayor. Director Reed's investigation had been the surgical strike she intended, cutting out the cancerous tumor at the heart of the department. David Carter, with his name and reputation fully restored, became a powerful voice for reform. He used the substantial settlement he received from the city to finally build the youth center he had dreamed of, naming it the Peterson Center in honor of the officer whose conscience had set him free. Ben Peterson, after receiving a commendation from the FBI director herself, had resigned from the force. He couldn't wear the uniform anymore, but he worked alongside Carter at the center, helping kids who might have otherwise fallen prey to men like Donovan and Russo. On the 1-year anniversary of the arrests, Director Evelyn Reed stood at a podium in Washington, D.C. She wasn't there to celebrate. Her expression was as serious and focused as it had been in that courtroom. "The convictions of Jack Donovan and his co-conspirators are not a final victory," she said to the assembled press. "They are a stark and necessary reminder. A reminder that power unchecked will always corrupt. A reminder that the shield of public service cannot be used as a sword against the public itself. Our work in that city is not finished. The broader investigation into systemic misconduct continues. Justice is not an event, it is a process. It is a constant, vigilant, and unending pursuit." She looked into the cameras, her dark eyes seeming to pierce through the lens, to speak to every citizen watching. "To those who would abuse their power, know this. We are watching. To those who feel voiceless, who have been wronged by a system meant to protect them, know this. We are listening. The halls of justice must echo with truth, and my administration, the Federal Bureau of Investigation, will spare no effort to ensure that not a single whisper of corruption is allowed to stand." There was no applause, just the frantic clicking of cameras. Director Reed didn't smile. She simply gathered her notes and walked away from the podium. Her work, the silent, relentless hunt for justice, still far from over. In a federal prison hundreds of miles away, a former detective sat in a small gray cell, the echo of a clicking handcuff, a permanent ghost in the silence of his ruined life. The scent of fresh paint and sawdust had replaced the sterile odor of the courtroom in David Carter's life. 2 years after his exoneration, the Peterson Community Center was a vibrant reality, a splash of color and life in a neighborhood that had seen too much gray. Inside, the cacophony was joyful. The rhythmic squeak of sneakers on the basketball court, the clatter of chess pieces in the study hall, the excited chatter of teenagers arguing over a video game. It was the sound of potential, the sound of a future reclaimed. David stood near the entrance, a soft smile on his face as he watched Ben Peterson patiently showing a shy 10-year-old girl named Maya how to hold a paintbrush. Ben had found a quiet purpose here that the police uniform had never given him. The haunted look in his eyes was gone, replaced by a weary but genuine contentment. "You're better with them than I am," David said, coming to stand beside him. "You have the patience of a saint." Ben chuckled, wiping a stray smudge of blue paint from Maya's cheek. "It's easy when you see the stakes. Every kid we keep in here is one less kid for the Donovans of the world to prey on out there." The name still carried a weight, a ghost that lingered at the edges of their new lives. They had won, but the victory had left scars. David's trust in institutions was permanently fractured, and Ben carried the quiet burden of having betrayed a brotherhood, even a corrupt one. "Heard anything?" Ben asked, his voice low. David shook his head. Just the usual. Donovan lost another appeal. His lawyer is still screaming about FBI misconduct. They're trying to paint Reed as some kind of political operative. Let them scream, Ben said, turning his attention back to the painting. He's in a concrete box. That's all that matters. But the box, David was beginning to fear, was not as secure as it seemed. The night before, he had found the driver's side tire of his car slashed. That could be random vandalism. But tucked under the windshield wiper was a single black feather. It was identical to the feathers on the raven tattoo that snaked up the forearm of Anthony the Suit Gallo, the mob enforcer Donovan had been photographed with. It wasn't a random act. It was a message, subtle and chilling. A reminder that while the king was in his cage, his knights were still on the board. He hadn't told Ben yet. There was no sense in them both losing sleep. In Washington, D.C., Director Evelyn Reed was facing a different kind of threat, one waged not with knives and feathers but with political rhetoric and budgetary knives. She sat at a polished mahogany table in a Senate hearing room, the air thick with feigned civility and genuine hostility. Across from her sat Senator Owen Wallace, a florid man with a booming voice and deep ties to national police unions. He saw Reed's sweeping investigation not as a cleansing, but as an attack on law enforcement itself. Director Reed, Wallace began, leaning into his microphone, the budget request from your office for the ongoing Urban Integrity Initiative is substantial. It represents a 15% increase. Yet the high-profile convictions were over a year ago. The main players are incarcerated. The city in question has reformed its department. The question I and this committee have is, when does this crusade end? When do you let these fine police departments get back to the business of policing without the FBI constantly looking over their shoulder? Arthur Sterling, seated beside Reed, shifted in his seat, his bulldog-like face tightening. Reed remained perfectly still, her hands clasped on the table before her. Senator, she began, her voice calm and measured, cutting through the senator's bluster. We call it an initiative, not a crusade. A crusade implies a blind, zealous faith. Our work is based on evidence and intelligence. The convictions of Donovan and his direct subordinates were the visible part of the cancer. Our ongoing work is the chemotherapy required to ensure it doesn't return. Chemotherapy? Wallace scoffed. A dramatic metaphor, Director. Some of my constituents, men and women who wear a badge, might call it a witch hunt. Morale is at an all-time low. Good officers are afraid to be proactive, terrified that a minor procedural error will land them in a federal hearing room like this one. A good officer has nothing to fear from transparency, Reed countered smoothly. The subject of our ongoing investigation, former Deputy Chief Robert Morrison, is not a good officer. Our intelligence suggests he was the architect of the financial schemes that Donovan and Chen executed. He was the one who provided the institutional cover. He is, to continue the metaphor, the primary tumor. And we have been unable to excise him because potential witnesses, including decorated police officers, are suddenly recanting their preliminary statements. They are afraid. And their fear is not of the FBI, Senator. It's of the remnants of Morrison's and Donovan's network. Wallace waved a dismissive hand. Allegations and intelligence. What you don't have is a case. What you have is an expensive, open-ended fishing expedition that is hamstringing local law enforcement. I will be recommending to this committee that your budget request be denied. Reed held his gaze, her eyes like chips of flint. That would be a grave mistake, Senator. The battle lines were drawn. The unseen war had officially begun. Miles away in the stark, oppressive environment of USP Allenwood, Jack Donovan was thriving. Prison had not broken him. It had merely provided him with a new, more challenging chessboard. His charisma and cunning, once used to manipulate city officials, were now employed to gain influence among the inmates, and more importantly, the guards. Favors, information, and contraband flowed through him. He was a king in a smaller, more brutal kingdom. He sat in the visitation room, separated by thick plexiglass from a slick, thin man in an expensive suit. This wasn't his appeals lawyer. This was a different kind of counsel. The pressure on Reed is working, the lawyer, Mr. Silas, said into the receiver. Wallace is playing his part perfectly. The media is starting to pick up the FBI overreach narrative. Donovan smiled, a cold, empty thing. Good. Reed thinks she's a surgeon. We're going to show her that if you cut into a thing, it bleeds. What about the other matter? The message was delivered to Carter, Silas confirmed. Subtle as you requested. Just a feather to ruffle his. He's the linchpin, Donovan said, his eyes distant, calculating. He and the traitor, Peterson. They're Reed's poster boys. Her whole crusade is built on their story. If their story becomes one of tragedy, if the community starts to believe that standing with the FBI only brings you pain, her support evaporates. The witnesses Morrison is worried about will stay silent forever. Morrison is getting nervous. He wants to know you can still control Gallo's people on the outside. You tell Morrison, Donovan said, his voice dropping to a near whisper, laced with venom, that he owes me. He sat in his corner office while I took the fall. My control is absolute. You also tell him it's time for the next step. I don't want Carter hurt, not yet. I want him scared. I want the whole city to see that he's not safe. I want the Peterson Center to feel like a target. Donovan leaned back, a look of grim satisfaction on his face. He was fighting his war from the inside, a spider pulling at the threads of the web he had built over decades. Evelyn Reed had taken his freedom, his career, his name. He was going to take her legacy and burn it to the ground. The FBI team, meanwhile, felt like they were chasing ghosts. Chloe Evans, the brilliant financial analyst, stared at a screen full of encrypted ledgers and deleted files. Morrison was a ghost, she said in frustration to Arthur Sterling. He never used his own name, never signed a physical document. He used a series of cutouts and verbal commands. The people who could connect him to the money are the same ones who are now refusing to talk. We have a mountain of circumstantial evidence, but nothing that a good lawyer can't tear apart. It was then that the call came in from their field office, the report of the threat against David Carter. Sterling listened, his expression grim. He put the phone down and looked at his team. It started, he said simply. Donovan isn't rotting away. He's reaching out. That evening at the community center, Ben Peterson's old instincts flared to life. As he was locking up, he saw a dark sedan parked across the street, its engine idling. It had been there for an hour. It was the same car he'd seen earlier that day near the playground. He walked back inside, his heart pounding. David, he said, his voice tight, come with me to the security office. Together, they rewound the footage from the exterior cameras. They zoomed in on the car. The driver's face was obscured, but the passenger who got out for a moment to take a call was unmistakable. It was a man named Frankie Fists Moretti, one of Anthony Gallo's chief lieutenants. A man Ben had arrested twice during his time on the force. David's blood ran cold. The feather wasn't a memory, it was a promise. They're watching us, Ben. No, Ben said, his eyes locked on the screen. They're not just watching, they're planning. David pulled out his phone and dialed the number for the FBI agent who had been his contact since the trial. In her office late at night, surrounded by budget reports and political analyses, Director Reed received the update. The pieces clicked into place with horrifying clarity. The political pressure from Wallace wasn't a separate issue. The stonewalling of the Morrison investigation wasn't just scared cops. The threats against David Carter weren't just prison revenge. It was all one coordinated counteroffensive, orchestrated by Donovan from his cell, executed by Morrison and Gallo, and given political air cover by Senator Wallace. A cold, hard anger settled in her chest. They thought she was a politician they could outmaneuver. They thought she was a bureaucrat they could tie up in red tape. They had forgotten who she was. She was a hunter, and they had just given her a fresh trail. She picked up her secure line and dialed Arthur Sterling. Arthur, she said, her voice quiet but vibrating with renewed intensity. Forget the financials for a moment. Moretti is watching the Peterson Center. That connects Gallo's crew directly to intimidating a federal witness. It's the leverage we needed. She paused, looking out at the glittering lights of the Capitol. Morrison and Gallo. It's the same snake, Arthur, just two different heads. This is no longer a public corruption case. This is a RICO conspiracy, active and ongoing, involving organized crime and political actors. The unseen war just went public. Take them down. Use whatever resources you need. And Arthur, this time, Let's make sure there are no echoes. This story serves as a powerful testament to the idea that no one is above the law. It's a chilling reminder that the arrogance of power is often the seed of its own destruction. We saw how Donovan, Russo, and Chen, believing themselves to be untouchable, celebrated their corruption in the open, completely oblivious to the quiet, methodical force of justice gathering in the shadows. Dr. Evelyn Reed represents more than just the FBI. She represents the principle of accountability, the silent, unwavering pursuit of truth that must hold power in check. Her victory wasn't just in the arrests, but in restoring faith to a broken man in a fractured community. If this story of karmic justice and the triumph of integrity resonated with you, please help us share it. Click the like button, share this video with your friends, and subscribe to our channel for more dramatic stories where truth prevails and karma delivers its final, unassailable verdict. Thank you for listening.